Part 37. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 361. At this time, Professor Charles seemed to have suddenly remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. Lin Yu seemed to be able to see Professor Charles's confusion. At this time, he also slightly adjusted his brows and smiled. "Professor, if you have anything to say, just say it." After hearing what Lin Yu said, Professor Charles nodded lightly. "Actually, it's not a big deal, it's just that I hope you can take me there with you." After Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, a bit of confusion flashed through his eyes. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at Professor Charles, with complete confusion in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "It's full of confusion. Where are you going?" Professor Charles rolled his eyes at Lin Yu angrily. "You guys definitely understand what I mean, so don't pretend to be confused here and take me to that place with you. This is me. The only request." Professor Charles' eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. At this time, when Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, a bit of complexity flashed across his face. At this time, he couldn't help but adjust his brows so slightly. "But that place is extremely dangerous. I'm afraid you might encounter some danger if you go with us. If you really encounter any danger, it will really be my fault." After Professor Charles heard what Lin Yu said, he waved his hand casually. "It doesn't matter, it's not a big deal. Take me there. I have to do some things when I go there." At this time, after Lin Yu heard Professor Charles say this, his brows seemed to be condensed together, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a bit of a wry smile. Professor Charles glared at Lin Yu fiercely. "Is this matter so difficult? Believe me, there is absolutely no way I will hold you back." Professor Charles's eyes were quite firm, and at this time, after Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, he also gritted his teeth and said, "Okay, my great Professor Charles, since you've already said that, if I don't take you there, I'm afraid it would be a bit unreasonable." After Professor Charles heard what Lin Yu said, his face suddenly became so happy, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with excitement. "Yes, very good. As long as I can go to that place this time, I will die with no regrets." Professor Charles's eyes flashed with nostalgia, and even Lin Yu didn't know what exactly Professor Charles was missing. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly realized that Professor Charles's place seemed a little unsafe. At this time, Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at Professor Charles. "Professor, this place may be a bit dangerous. Judging from the characters of those guys, I'm afraid they know about it. After you get here, I'm afraid." After Professor Charles heard Lin Yu say this, some complicated colors flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly. "What you said is indeed true. If that's the case, I'm afraid I have to trouble you this time." Lin Yu just waved his hand casually. "Professor, you are too polite. You can just follow me this time." Professor Charles also nodded gently, and the two of them hit it off so well. At this moment, a special color flashed through Professor Charles's eyes. No one knew what Professor Charles was thinking at this time. Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at Professor Charles, and then he frowned slightly. A special color flashed between the corners of his eyes and the tips of his eyebrows, and his brows seemed to be furrowed together. At this moment, Professor Charles seemed to have remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, his brows sank slightly, and something strange flashed in his eyes. A brilliance. "There is something I still want to tell you." When Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, a bit of confusion flashed across his eyes and brows. His eyes stared straight at Professor Charles, and then he just adjusted his brows slightly. "What do you want to say? Please speak." At this time, Professor Charles's brows were like this, as if they were knitted together. He turned his head, 3 different gleams flashed in his eyes, and then he sighed quietly. Well. Professor Charles's face was very ugly. After Lin Yu saw Professor Charles like this, the confusion in his eyes became more and more obvious. At this moment, he was like this 2 foot tall like a monk, he is confused and has no idea why Professor Charles is like this. I would like to ask Professor Charles, are you confused in any way? If so, if you don't mind, you can tell me about it. After Professor Charles heard what Lin Yu said, his face was slightly condensed, and his eyes seemed to flash with some special colors. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled, if you have anything to say, just say it, you don't have to be so polite to me. In that case, then I'll say it, can you help me find someone? Professor Charles's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and some special colors flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly, and his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together. Excuse me, who do you want to find? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Professor Charles, and some special colors appeared in his eyes. At this time, Professor Charles also sighed leisurely, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Alas, this matter is a long story. In fact, it was 3 days ago that my companion was captured by someone. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 362. At this time, Lin Yu half squinted his eyes. He turned his head and glanced at Professor Charles. Then he adjusted his brows slightly, and there was a flash of light in the corners of his eyes and brows. Look of confusion. Abducted? By whom? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Professor Charles, and there was quite a bit of confusion between his brows. There was a bit of a wry smile on Professor Charles's lips, and there was a look of complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. I don't know who took them away, but I know they were taken away in a night bar. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, a somewhat meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a hint of mockery flashed in his eyes. I see, it's this night bar again. I've long heard that many people were kidnapped in this night bar. Is it possible that this night bar really has an inescapable relationship with the night bar? Lin Yu's eyes were full of confusion. At this moment, his brows seemed to be condensed together, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with confusion. After Professor Charles heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but sigh quietly. There was a sense of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. Yes, I always feel that there is something wrong with this night bar, but what can I do? That day my friends and I went to investigate the problem of this night bar, but he still disappeared. Now I am afraid no one dares to do it easily. Let's go investigate this night bar. After Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, a look of confusion flashed across his eyes and brows, and then he nodded gently, with a few meaningful words raised at the corners of his mouth. Smile. Don't worry, I will take care of this matter. I will definitely get to the bottom of this matter. Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a certain look of determination, and at this time, the corners of his mouth also evoked a somewhat meaningful smile. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Professor Charles nodded gently, and then sighed leisurely. Oh, sometimes some things are really not so easy to talk about. It's a headache, it's a headache. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a complicated look flashed in his eyes. Actually, some things are not so difficult to do, and there are still solutions to some things. When Professor Charles heard Lin Yu say this, he had a thoughtful look on his face. After a moment, he seemed to have remembered something and turned his head to look at Lin Yu. Take a look. Then when are you going to investigate this night bar? Professor Charles's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of expectation. At this time, Lin Yu heard Professor Charles say this. After that, a bit of a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, after he struggled for a moment, a look of determination flashed in his eyes. It's better to choose a different day than to hit it. How about today? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Professor Charles. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Professor Charles nodded slightly after hesitating for a moment, with a few curls at the corners of his mouth. Each has a meaningful smile. At this time, after Lin Yu saw this scene, a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. He turned his head and glanced at Professor Charles, and then slightly adjusted his brows. Tune. There's something I want to ask you. Professor Charles heard Lin Yu, and after saying this, he nodded softly, and then smiled. What else do you want to ask? At this time, Professor Charles's face was obviously a little impatient. A cold smile suddenly appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth. He turned his head towards Professor Charles and gave him a cold glance, with a hint of coldness flashing in his eyes. Actually, I don't mean to say anything nonsense, I just want to ask you, how long are you going to pretend? After Professor Charles heard what Lin Yu said, a hint of panic clearly flashed across his face. He subconsciously took a few steps back, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu. A special color flashed across Yu Yu's eyes. I really don't understand what you are talking about. Don't make this kind of joke with me, this kind of joke is not funny at all. After Lin Yu heard what Professor Charles said, the smile on the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. A bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and his brows were like this, as if they were screwed together. Stop pretending, this parchment is fake. In fact, I already knew it from the beginning. Although your play is very similar, this parchment is your biggest failure. This parchment has gone through so many years. How can a parchment roll not contain half of the wind and frost? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Professor Charles, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corners of his mouth, with a hint of gloom in his eyes. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Professor Charles's face slightly condensed, his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting, you are really a very interesting little guy, even I have to admit this. After hearing what Professor Charles said, Lin Yu's eyes were filled with three different lights, his eyebrows were slightly raised, and a sneer appeared on the corners of his mouth. Really? But when you taste my fist later, you may not think so of me, I just hope you can have a pleasant experience at that time. Lin Yu said slowly, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of mockery. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Professor Charles slowly reached his hand towards his face. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 363. At this time, Professor Charles slowly took off the human skin mask on his face. Under the mask at this time, there was a face called Lin Yu that was both familiar and unfamiliar. After Lin Yu saw that face, a somewhat complicated meaning flashed in his eyes. At this time, he couldn't help but think so. His brows wrinkled slightly. Is it you? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on that person, and there was quite a bit of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, the man smiled at Lin Yu and said, "It seems that my eldest son was right to choose you. My younger daughter also seemed to have chosen you. At first, I thought you might have used it on them. What a special method, the result seems not to be the case now." After Lin Yu heard Duke William say this, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he shook his head and smiled. To be honest, you surprised me. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Duke William's eyes flashed with confusion. At this time, he couldn't help but adjust his brows so slightly. Oh, it's really interesting. Then you can come and tell me how I can teach you about surprises. What surprises me about this is probably that you can actually recognize me. This is really surprising to me. When Duke William heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but burst out laughing. A special look flashed across his eyes and brows, and finally he frowned slightly. Maybe so, maybe not. At this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Duke William stared directly at Lin Yu. The two people looked at each other, and the air between them seemed to have solidified. After a moment, Duke William also smiled like this, "You are really a very interesting little guy." Lin Yu nodded gently towards Duke William, "You are also a very interesting person. There is indeed a problem in the night bar, and one of my friends was really captured by that damn organization, so I actually want to come to you for help this time. I hope you can help me, how about it?" Duke William's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly. He turned his head and glanced at Duke William, with some complex colors flashing in his eyes. At this time, Duke William couldn't help but smile like this, staring directly at Lin Yu, with something strange flashing in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, Lin Yu's brows seemed to be knitted together, and finally he sighed leisurely. After waiting for a while, the two people just looked at each other and smiled. But there is no such thing as a free lunch in this world. It is not good for me to help you, Duke William, to act like a duke this time. Let me suffer a loss. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he stared straight at Duke William. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Duke William couldn't help but adjust his brows slightly, with a shudder in his eyes. There was a bit of a special color, and then he smiled like this. "Tell me, what do you want?" Duke William's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu, and three different brilliance seemed to flash in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly, and then sighed faintly, "I don't know very well, how about I owe it this time?" After hearing what Lin Yu said, Duke William nodded softly after thinking for a moment, "Okay." At this time, Lin Yu heard what Duke William said, and then walked outside. Duke William's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu's back, with three different gleams in his eyes. "What are you going to do?" At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. He turned his head and glanced at Duke William, with a somewhat evil smile on his lips. "Go help you." After seeing Lin Yu like this, Duke William's eyes flashed with three different lights, and then he nodded slightly, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a few meaningful smiles. "Okay, then you have to move faster, otherwise they are likely to find you." Duke William's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu just smiled after hearing what Duke William said, but he didn't say anything more. "Just turn around and leave." Duke William's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu's back, and three different lights flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, no one knew what Duke William was thinking about. Night bar. This is definitely the largest and most popular underground bar in the city. Countless men and women are dancing restlessly on the dance floor. Everyone is beating rhythmically to the music, and their eyes are filled with a kind of madness. No one dared to make trouble here, even though they had been paralyzed by alcohol, but no one dared to make trouble here, because the owner of this bar was called Marriott. At this time, in a private room, a man was sitting on the sofa. The man half closed his eyes were quite complicated, he just shook his head slightly, and three different lights flashed in his eyes. "Interesting, it's really interesting." At this time, a woman was kneeling in front of the man. The man gently stretched out two fingers, hooked the woman's chin, and the corners of his mouth raised a few meaningful smiles, and his eyes flashed a few teasing. "Interesting, it's really interesting, has anyone ever said that you are very beautiful?" The woman's eyes and eyebrows were full of a sense of fear, and two lines of tears were drawn on her pretty face. She slowly raised her head and looked at the man, and the corners of her mouth raised a few bitter smiles. No, no. At this time, the man had a wicked smile on his face, and then he leaned over, lowered his head to the woman's ear, and then whispered softly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 364. Then today I said you are beautiful, are you very happy? The woman shook her head first, then realized something was wrong, and then nodded crazily. At this moment, the man's eyes were staring directly at the woman, as if he was looking at a fat sheep waiting to be slaughtered. At this time, the man was smiling more and more happily and wildly, as if he had encountered something that needed him to be happy the most in the world, and he was laughing wildly. After the woman saw this scene, she felt as if she had fallen into an ice cave. Her eyes were full of helplessness. She subconsciously took a few steps back and looked at the man in a panic. At this time, the man just took a step forward, and then immediately hugged the woman. The bodyguards around him began to quietly withdraw. At this time, the woman struggled wildly. There were tears all over her face, but the more the woman struggled, the more wildly the man smiled. At the end, the woman suddenly grabbed an ashtray, pointed it at the man's head, and slapped it on the man's head. And at this moment, the man said with a burst of pain, he really let go of the woman. At this time, the woman's actions also completely angered the man. He turned his head, his eyes were fixed on the woman's body, and a wave of the murderous intention spread out from his body. The man suddenly smiled at this time. He smiled like a madman. The 2 rows of white teeth were even dazzling under the light. The woman's face was filled with fear, and she subconsciously took a few steps back. Her eyes were fixed on the man, and her eyes were full of helplessness. Sorry sir, I didn't mean it just now. Ha ha ha, you didn't mean it, did you? You told me you didn't mean it, am I right? At this time, the woman nodded like this, her face was a little pale, her face was full of helplessness, and there was a bit of a wry smile at the corner of her mouth. The man just came to the woman's side, grabbed the woman's hair, and suddenly knocked it on the floor. He smashed the woman's head crazily. At first, the woman screamed and screamed desperately. She struggled, but after a while the woman stopped moving. After a while, perhaps even the man felt a little tired, so he let go of the woman, and then he came to the door of the room and looked at the 2 people at the door. You guys come in and deal with this woman. After the man finished speaking, he turned around and left. In the restless dance floor, the man felt as warm and friendly as if he had arrived at home. After waiting for a while, he saw a tall, beautiful woman dancing on the dance floor. The man slowly approached the woman, just like a cheetah approaching its prey, but the woman obviously had some disdain for the man, so when the man approached the woman subconsciously moved towards her. The outside retreated like this. But the woman retreated toward the outside, and the man moved forward. After waiting for a while, the woman became a little angry. She turned her head and her eyes were fixed on the man. I said you are done, get out of here and stay away from me. After the man heard what the woman said, he suddenly laughed and his eyes were fixed on the woman. You are the first woman who dares to talk to me like this, which is really interesting. The woman just thought that the man was a lunatic, so she glanced at the man with a sneer on her lips. Boring. After the woman finished speaking, she was ready to leave directly, but at this time, the man just grabbed the woman's arm. At this time, the woman turned her head and her eyes were fixed on the man. There was a gloomy look in her eyes, and a cold aura radiated from the woman's body. Hurry up and release your paw, otherwise, don't blame me for being rude to you. The woman's eyes were staring straight at the man, and at this moment the man suddenly smiled. At this moment, he seemed to be completely crazy, and then he let go of the woman's hand. At this time, the corner of the woman's mouth curled up into a disdainful sneer. Wouldn't it be better to be like this earlier? If you want to tease me, I have to see if you have the strength. You are a ridiculous guy. But the next scene shocked the woman. The man just rounded his palm and slapped the woman on the face. The woman at this moment was also stunned. Her face was full of disbelief. She couldn't believe that this was true. At this moment, the woman was wailing and screaming. "You bastard, how dare you bully me like this? I'll fight you." But at this moment, the man's eyes seemed to be looking at a ridiculous clown with disdain and contempt on his face. "Stupid guy." After the man finished speaking, he suddenly took out a dagger from his waist, pointed it at the woman's lower abdomen, and stabbed it in without eating. At this time, the woman fell into a pool of blood in an instant, and at this time, those on the dance floor also let out screams, and then ran away in all directions. The man just stood on the dance floor, dancing selflessly, as if all this had nothing to do with him at all. He was completely immersed in his own world and couldn't extricate himself. At this time, a man walked towards him. When the man came to his side, he kicked him in the abdomen without saying a word. The man in the suit stared fixedly at the man in front of him. He seemed to be trying his best to restrain his anger. At this moment, he was completely like an angry leopard. "Asshole, I should have killed you if I had known earlier." The man raised his head and glanced at the man in the suit. His face was full of disdain at first, but when he saw the man's appearance clearly, his face suddenly turned ugly. At this time, he lowered his head. He walked down with a humble and respectful look on his face. "Big brother." Marriott's eyes were fixed on the man. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 365. I have a good bar, but now you have made it so messy. If you don't give me a reasonable explanation right now, I will throw you into this blender to make fish balls today. Marriott's voice was low and hoarse, and the murderous intent on his body was so awe-inspiring at this moment that the temperature around him seemed to have dropped several degrees in an instant. The man's whole body began to tremble like this. He was trembling desperately, and then he flashed in front of Wan Hao, and fell to his knees on the ground with a plop, his face full of a kind of prayer. Meaning, "Please, brother, please let me go. It's all my fault today. I drank a little too much, that's why I'm like this. Brother, if you want to kill me, I won't give you a cent complaint." Wan Hao suddenly laughed when he heard the man talking like this. His eyes were fixed on the man. "If you want to kill or behead, I will do whatever you want, no complaints, right? That's good, you can go to hell today and take my knife all the way. Don't worry, I will take care of your family." Wan Hao was talking unhurriedly, but the man was shaking as if he was sifting chaff, and his face was ugly and scary. At this time, he was shaking his head desperately. "No, brother, don't be like this. Brother, I have been by your side for so many years, and I have worked hard without any credit. Brother, I will never dare to do it next time." The people around him also fell to their knees on the ground, but Wan Hao just turned his back and closed his eyes. After a moment, he opened them and took out a cigarette from his pocket to light it for himself. "Superior. Have a nice trip." Marriott said these words almost through gritted teeth, his voice slightly trembling and hoarse. After the man saw Wan Hao say this, his face was filled with helplessness, and in the end he seemed to have resigned to his fate. "Okay, brother, I listen to you. I'll die if you let me." After the man finished speaking, he looked at the knife next to him, and then suddenly stabbed him in the heart. In the end, blood spurted out, and the man was lying in a pool of blood, and lost his breath at that time. Marriott just waved his hand so gently, with no emotion on his face, as if nothing had happened before. Everyone held their breath and did not even dare to take a breath, as if they were afraid of being angry. "Marriott, settlement him well and give him a settling in allowance." After Wan Hao finished speaking, he walked away immediately. After everyone heard what Wan Hao said, they lowered their heads helplessly. At this moment, a man directly blocked Wan Hao's way. The man's eyes were fixed on Wan Hao, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. Marriott's eyes were fixed on the man. He casually took out a cigarette and lit it for himself. A bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. "You're here. I've heard about it recently. You seem to have done a lot of great things. Even at night, my color changes when I hear your name. But I don't know why you came to me." Marriott looked quite calm, as calm and indifferent as if he were talking to a stranger about what to eat for breakfast, and there was no hint of panic at all. After Lin Yu saw Wan Hao like this, a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "It's interesting. It's really interesting. I didn't expect that the boss of the underground forces is actually wearing a suit and leather shoes. He actually looks a bit elegant. This reminds me of a word, do you know what it is?" Lin Yu stared straight at Wan Hao. After a moment, Wan Hao shook his head and smiled. "I really don't know what it is, but if you don't mind, it can help clarify the confusion. Beast in clothes. Beasts in clothes, ha 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 ha." After Wan Hao heard what Lin Yu said, he suddenly laughed like this. The laughter was so loud that everyone could hear his laughter, so he surrounded Lin Yu and his eyes were filled with death. It was nailed to Lin Yu's body, and a killing intent spread out. "It's very interesting. You are a very interesting person. No one dares to say that about me. In fact, even I like the word dressed like a beast very much. These 4 words are very pertinent, and what you said is true." When Lin Yu saw the crazy man in front of him, there was a bit of mockery in his eyes. "Yes, no one dares to say that in front of you. It just seems that I am a little bolder. But what I want to say is that I have always been so courageous." The man nodded. "What you said is indeed true. You have always been very courageous. There are many people here. Are you sure you can really handle it alone?" Wan Hao's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this moment, the air between the two people seemed to be in a ball. For some reason, when his younger brothers looked at Lin Yu, they had a kind of feeling in their hearts for no reason. Feeling of fear. No one dares to take action rashly, and no one dares to talk nonsense. They are just a bunch of soldiers and generals. You know that if I think about it, you will all die in just a moment. Lin Yu said this in a cold voice, and the murderous intent on his body was revealed without reservation. A cold momentum spread out, and everyone could even feel the temperature around him, as if it had suddenly dropped several degrees. Everyone couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva at the same time. They subconsciously took a few steps back, with fear in their eyes. "I know that what you said is indeed true. They are indeed some minions, not worth mentioning at all. This is true, but, have you ever thought about one thing?" "What is it?" Wan Hao's mouth corners raised a trace, an evil smile. "Why do you say that I dare to appear here so openly? I know that you are in danger now, why do I still talk so much nonsense to you instead of running away? Can you run away?" These 5 simple words revealed an unparalleled confidence. Wan Hao was stunned for a moment, and after a moment of stunnedness, he also spread his hands like this. "I have to admit that you are right, but don't you think there is another possibility? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 366. Of course Lin Yu understood what Wan Hao meant, but at this moment he still didn't have the slightest fear. He just waved his hand casually, and then glanced coldly at Wan Hao. "I'm too lazy to talk nonsense with you anymore. Call your people out quickly. I understand that this is just a game, but I'm not afraid if I dare to come. Marriott laughed instantly, as if he were a complete madman, and he nodded slightly. Very good, very good. I just like courageous people like you. It's just a pity that the two of us are enemies. Otherwise, the two of us can definitely have a drink. Drinking with you, I'm afraid you'll kill me when you're drunk. Marriott clapped his hands gently, and then several people wearing black robes with special symbols tattooed on their chests suddenly walked out of the rooms on both sides of the corridor. A slight smile appeared on Lin Yu's lips. You really think highly of me. Wan Hao just glanced at Lin Yu coldly. You are in the spotlight now, and I don't dare to slack off at all, so I called them all over. I believe you won't mind it? Wan Hao looked at Lin Yu with a smile, and Lin Yu just waved his hand casually. Of course not, it's just. At this time, Lin Yu was talking and looking around, but at this time he suddenly discovered the auras of several people, which were very strange. They seemed to be a little different from the ordinary owners of strange beasts. These people gave a very evil feeling. Lin Yu's face began to look a little ugly, and Wan Hao just stared at Lin Yu with a smile. Did you feel something? Are you happy? Marriott said calmly. I'm happy. I haven't been this happy for a long time. Thank you very much for arranging so many people to play with me. Without people, I worry that I won't be able to let my hands and feet go. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he rushed towards the person closest to him. Just now, Lin Yu had noticed that there seemed to be some strange magnetic field here, which caused him to lose contact with the strange beast. Moreover, this magnetic field should be blocked indiscriminately. There is no way to make any contact between him and the alien beasts. I am afraid that the same is true for these guys. There is no way. Wan Hao waved his hand gently, and then stepped back. The people around him rushed towards Lin Yu at the same time. They rushed towards Lin Yu at the same time, waving their hands. He hit the iron fist as big as a casserole, and his posture was like a punch, as if he wanted to kill Lin Yu. After a while, several people were fighting together at the same time. Their fists were like thunder and their palms were like tiger's wind, and every blow was directed towards Lin Yu's vitals. After all, the opponent still had a large number of people. Although Lin Yu was able to withstand it at first, but later on, because there were too many people on the opponent's side, he gradually started to fall behind. The smile on the corner of Marriott's mouth began to become more and more obvious. He lit a cigarette in the distance and started smoking it slowly. Watching the fire from the other side made him quite happy. A bit of excitement. At this time, Wan Hao seemed to be quite interested. He took off his suit directly, handed his suit to the person next to him, and turned to look at him. Take a good look at my suit, I'll go meet this guy. After Wan Hao finished speaking, he jumped down and rushed towards Lin Yu. The two people quickly fought together and became a ball. Wan Hao and Lin Yu were fighting so hard that they couldn't separate each other. After they fought like this for a while, Wan Hao stood up and kicked Lin Yu directly in the chest. After Lin Yu saw Wan Hao attacking towards him, a confident smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. He seemed to have been waiting for Wan Hao to take action. He just deliberately used less than half of his strength just to take the initiative. Which leads to Marriott. Wan Hao ducked and came to Lin Yu's side. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and a murderous intention spread. The two of them fought against each other, and the fight was very lively. At the end, Wan Hao suddenly stood up and kicked Lin Yu directly on the chest. Lin Yu's face condensed and his face instantly became ugly. After he was kicked on the chest, he began to realize how terrifying Lin Yu was. You just deliberately hid your moves, but it was really interesting. You are really an interesting guy. You want to lure me down to fight with you. Why? The people around him were obviously moving towards Lin Yu again. Those guys whose auras seemed a bit strange to Lin Yu felt like they couldn't kill Xiaoqiang. Just now, Lin Yu also attacked their vital points, but it was obvious that even if those people were hit by Lin Yu, if they were ordinary people, they would have been completely cold. But what happened to these guys? Nothing ever happened. The people around him stared at Lin Yu coldly, and a subtle feeling spread. Wan Hao's intention was obviously that he wanted to leave like this, because he knew that he might not be Lin Yu's opponent, but at this time, Lin Yu naturally could not let Wan Hao off the battlefield so easily. So when Wan Hao wanted to pull away, Lin Yu suddenly rushed towards Wan Hao. Originally Wan Hao thought that Lin Yu had used 70% to 80% of his power. Even if there was another outbreak, maybe it wasn't that strong, but it was obvious that he was wrong about Lin Yu. Lin Yu quickly stepped in front of Wan Hao. He rounded his fist and hit Wan Hao hard again. Wan Hao suddenly stretched out his hand, trying to block Lin Yu, but the arm bones of his forearm were directly smashed by Lin Yu's fist. Then Lin Yu changed his fist into claws and grabbed him all at once. Marriott's throat. Wan Hao struggled desperately, but in front of Lin Yu, this struggle seemed a bit ridiculous. This feeling should be amazing, don't you think so? Wan Hao stared at Lin Yu with a look of reluctance, but it seemed useless in the face of absolute power. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 367. Lin Yu turned around, looked around, and then said coldly, "Now this guy is in my hands. If you don't want him to die, you'd better leave quickly, otherwise but don't blame me for being rude to him." At this time, a man in a black robe quietly took a step forward. He took off his cloak, took off the mask on his face, and just gave Lin Yu a cold look. "Look, he looks a bit like me." The man suddenly spoke. Lin Yu took a look at the face under the mask, and a look of disbelief flashed through his eyes. At this time, he was staring straight at the man. "How is that possible?" The man just laughed like this, "Ha ha ha, when I take off the mask, all my opponents look like you now. It's just a pity that I still like this guy's temperament. He would be good as my substitute." The man just said it unhurriedly. It was obvious that what this man said was good. Lin Yu exerted a slight force on his palm, and the man's face turned a purple color. He slapped Lin Yu's arm desperately, as if he wanted Lin Yu to let him go. A moment later, Lin Yu threw him away. The man fell heavily to the ground. He got up a moment later, and then started laughing wildly. "Ha ha ha, I didn't expect it. I really didn't expect you to be so stupid. I didn't expect you to believe such words." The man seemed to be laughing like crazy. After Lin Yu heard what the man said, his face began to look a little ugly. He slowly turned his head and glanced at the man. "Did you just lie to me?" As Lin Yu spoke through gritted teeth, a murderous intention gradually began to spread. The man from before also shook his head. "Who says Marriott can only be one person?" Lin Yu heard this. After the two of them said this, he glanced at them again, feeling quite confused in his heart. "If it happens again, I have absolute confidence that I can subdue you. If you don't believe it, you can give it a try." Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly, and a killing intent gradually spread out from his body. They seemed to believe what Lin Yu said, so they nodded slightly. "We believe what you said, and I also believe that you did not come here to kill me this time. You can tell me what your purpose is, and we can talk about it. In that case, it may be the best choice." Marriott said softly. "Duke William, you have a companion in your hands. I hope you can release him. This is the purpose of my trip. If you are willing to let him go, I will leave now with my people." Lin Yu said coldly. The two of them looked at each other, and then shook their heads. "Duke William's friend? I really don't know who it is. After all, in my impression, I have never caught any of Duke William's friends. Moreover, Duke William has many masters. I never provoke those famous and powerful people. That's why I've been able to live here for so long." Lin Yu narrowed his eyes to a slit and stared at the two of them. Are you telling the truth? But Duke William said that you two kidnapped his friend. I don't think this looks like him. You're lying. Lin Yu's voice was a little low, and the two of them looked at each other. Of course you can't believe us. But we did not lie to you. If you don't believe it, then there is nothing I can do. After the two of them finished speaking, they spread their hands. At this moment, Lin Yu was like a 2-foot-old monk, confused and completely confused about who he should trust now. It's interesting. If you don't teach it, it would be very interesting now. I have heard of that old guy. There is no truth in his mouth. I believe he should be lying to you. Maybe he just wants to trick you into dying. After all, although the alien beast in your body is powerful, you should also be able to. You can feel it. I can block the communication between you and the beast. After hearing Wan Hao's words, Lin Yu's face gradually turned ugly. His brows seemed to be knitted together, and then he shook his head. Strange, then why did he have to kill me? This is a little unreasonable. There is always someone who wants to borrow a knife to kill someone. Besides, you still have this half of the map in your hand. Everyone knows the battlefield of the ancient gods. There are countless treasures there. Wouldn't it be nice to have one less person to divide the treasures? After Lin Yu heard what Wan Hao said, he suddenly smiled. He slowly raised his head and glanced at Wan Hao. How did you know that I had that half of the map? You know, this half of the map just came into my hands. Not many people know it. Marriott began to realize that he seemed to have made a mistake. He just smiled. I guess, is there any problem? Do you dare to say that you didn't get the half of the map? Marriott seems to be a bit of a rogue. Lin Yu stared at Wan Hao with a smile on his face, and his expression was like this, as if he was about to freeze. Answer my question, how do you know this? Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness, and a cold feeling spread from Wan Hao's body. Finally, Wan Hao slowly began to turn into a very special monster. Half of Marriott's face was made of flesh, and half of his face was completely skeleton. Moreover, half of his face was purple and black, his teeth slowly lengthened into fangs, and a tentacle actually sprouted from the top of his head. At this time, Wan Hao's body also slowly grew a pair of wings, and his body was as black as ink. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face began to look a little ugly. The evil beast, did you sacrifice yourself to the beast? Lin Yu's voice was trembling slightly. At this time, his whole body was naturally extremely angry. You must know that this guy looked like this, which meant that he had given up his soul and completely handed it over to the alien beast. A person becomes the slave of an alien beast, and most of these evil alien beasts are very evil and murderous guys. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 368. The reason why these strange beasts are criticized by people is entirely because most of these strange beasts only know killing in their hearts. Apart from killing, they know no other things. They are murderous and can turn the world upside down every time. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face began to look ugly, and his entire expression seemed to be completely frozen. Wan Hao's face was filled with a kind of arrogance, as if he was eating Lin Yu. He spoke so coldly to Lin Yu in a voice like sawing wood. Boy, his friend is indeed in my hands now, but if you want to get him back, that is simply a fantasy. Originally, I didn't want to expose my trump card, but now it seems that I can only expose it. You will definitely die today. Do you have any last words? When Lin Yu saw Wan Hao's confident look, his eyes were full of contempt. It's ridiculous. Who do you think you are? If you want to kill me, you may not be able to do it in your next life. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards Wan Hao. His speed was extremely fast, even much faster than before. At this time, Wan Hao just turned slightly to the front, and then grabbed Lin Yu, and then a hint of a sinister smile appeared on his face at this moment, and finally dumped Lin Yu like this. Fly out. Lin Yu fell heavily to the ground, and his face became a little ugly. However, he was not panic at this time. After all, he was just testing Wan Hao just now. Wan Hao slowly walked towards Lin Yu, with a rather gloomy look in his eyes. He looked at Lin Yu condescendingly and suddenly smiled. Boy, today I will give you a chance. Surrender to me obediently. Maybe I can spare your life. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude. At this moment, Lin Yu's face also evoked a bit of a joking smile, and his eyes were full of disdain. Don't you think you can do it now so naively? It's enough to satisfy me. Lin Yu said in a cold voice. The blood in his body was surging, and the cold color called Wan Hao again for some reason, and he had a bad premonition in his heart. Wan Hao glanced at Lin Yu coldly, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and murderous intent surged in his body. Boy, you can eat randomly, but you can't talk nonsense. Could it be that you really want to die today? After Wan Hao finished speaking, he suddenly grabbed Lin Yu's body. His claws were very powerful, as if he wanted to completely scratch Lin Yu to death. Lin Yu's face darkened, but there was no trace of fear in his eyes. He just turned sideways suddenly, dodging Wan Hao's attack, and then immediately he turned back and kicked Wan Hao on the chest. Wan Hao took several steps back before he managed to stabilize his body, a bit of disbelief flashing in his eyes. How is this possible? How could your strength be so terrifying? Is it possible? At this moment, Lin Yu stood up slowly. He just turned his head and glanced coldly at Wan Hao, with a cold light flashing in his eyes. Don't you think that I am not your opponent? Don't you think about what you are? What you did just now was just to make you arrogant. Otherwise, how could I know that you have already did you sacrifice your soul to the evil god? Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly like this, and Wan Hao's face began to look ugly. His fists clenched loudly, and the killing intent began to surge in his body. Boy, since you want to seek death, it would be really unjustifiable if I don't help you. After Wan Hao finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu, his speed becoming more than 3 times faster than before. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face was filled with solemnity. Even he had to admit that after this guy sacrificed his soul to the evil god, his strength seemed to be stronger than before. Several times more. But after a moment, Lin Yu shook his head. The strength is pretty good, but it's still a bit too weak. Wan Hao never expected that Lin Yu's strength would be so terrifying, and he never imagined that Lin Yu's character would be so terrifying. It's really a good method to lure the enemy deep, it's really powerful. Wan Hao's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and a murderous aura surged through his body. Lin Yu just waved his hand gently, thank you. In fact, compared with you, it seems a little worse. You can hide here for such a long time without being discovered. I should say you are lucky. Or should I say you can pretend? Lin Yu's tone suddenly turned gloomy at the end, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and a killing intent was unreservedly revealed in his body. At this time, Wan Hao also suddenly took a step forward. He stepped directly in front of Lin Yu, and then transformed into his previous appearance. Alas, actually I think we can cooperate. I can release the guy you mentioned, but you have to do me a favor. Lin Yu heard Wan Hao's words, and a sneer appeared on his face at this moment, and the murderous intent on his body emerged quietly. Oh, it's really interesting. Then come and tell me, what do you want me to do for you? Take our 2 brothers into the ancient battlefield of the gods together. Of course, you can also refuse, but you have to believe me, by then you will become much more troublesome than now. Lin Yu was furious when he heard Wan Hao's words. He said to Wan Hao in a low and hoarse voice, are you threatening me? Between Lin Yu's eyebrows, there was a kind of coldness, and the murderous intent on his body was so directly revealed. Wan Hao's face began to become a little ugly, but he still nodded. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 369. Yes, you can think so, but you should also know what the strength of our organization is. We have the strength to do what we say, and I think you should be able to understand it too. A moment later, Lin Yu suddenly smiled like this. He half closed his eyes, and after thinking for a moment, he nodded slightly. Actually, if I kill you and then slowly find someone else, it seems like I can save a lot of trouble, don't you think? Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly like this, with a certain determination in his eyes. The two Wan Hao brothers looked at each other, and then they took a step forward. You can try, but I guarantee that the price you will pay will be much more than it is now. You don't have to believe it, but we will do what we say. At this time, the two brothers were talking coldly to each other, and a subtle feeling spread and reverberated among the three of them. And just a moment later, Lin Yu stood up suddenly, and finally rushed forward. His speed was extremely fast, and he was already 3 inches in front of the two brothers in an instant. At this moment, Lin Yu's and their faces were almost touching, and even they had to admit that the terrifying aura exuded by Lin Yu made the two of them a little scared at this moment. I advise you to think carefully before doing this, otherwise you will be in big trouble. Marriott said in a cold voice. Although it seemed to be a kind reminder on the surface, everyone knew that it was a stern threat. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly smiled and waved lightly. Well, even I have to admit that you have indeed won. I can take you away, but as you just said, you have to hand over the guy you captured to me first. After the two Wan Hao brothers heard what Lin Yu said, their faces instantly became excited. The two of them looked at each other with a look of disbelief in their eyes. They simply couldn't believe it. All this is actually true. Of course there is no problem with this, but you must remember that these words you have said now are what you promised us. If you dare to go back on it, you will be dead. Marriott said coldly. But at this moment, Lin Yu looked unconcerned. He just waved his hand casually, with a bit of a sneer on his face. Do you think it's necessary for me to lie to you now? Just do as I say, and I won't treat you badly when the time comes. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he turned around and left. The two of them stared directly at Lin Yu's back. When they reached the corner, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something and turned his head to look at them. Don't forget what I want. If you dare to forget, what will happen? I think you should also know. Lin Yu's voice was low and hoarse. When the two of them heard Lin Yu say this, they nodded like chickens pecking at rice. After Lin Yu left, they were relieved at this moment. At this time, when Lin Yu had just walked out of the bar, a drunk woman stumbled directly into Lin Yu's arms. Lin Yu's face was a little ugly. He stared coldly at the woman in front of him. Who are you? If you are drunk and crazy, stay away from me, otherwise. But before Lin Yu could finish speaking, the woman hugged Lin Yu and put her hands around Lin Yu's neck. Lin Yu wanted to push the woman away, but the woman almost fell down. Lin Yu he picked her up again. At this time, Lin Yu's face began to look a little ugly. Oh, I really owe you. At this time, Lin Yu felt helpless, so Bian could only pick up the woman and walk towards a hotel. By the time he arrived at the hotel, perhaps this kind of thing happened often, and the waiter was already used to it. Now we only have the presidential suite, 3,000 a night. 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead. Through the disdainful eyes at the front desk, he clearly felt a little uncomfortable. However, at this time, Lin Yu still nodded so gently and left the room obediently. The fee was paid. This is the door number, go up yourself. Lin Yu just felt that the service attitude at the front desk was very problematic, but when he thought that he came to check out a room with such a drunk woman in his arms in the middle of the night, it was indeed easier for people to misunderstand him, and he did not give any explanation. Because he knows very well that people only make their own judgments based on what they see. And once a person determines this matter, no matter how you explain it, it will have no effect at all, and may even only play some opposite role. Effect. After Lin Yu opened the door, he directly put the woman on the bed, and then turned around and left. After Lin Yu left, the receptionist saw that he left so quickly, and there was a look of disdain on his face. At this time, Lin Yu only felt that he had suffered a critical hit of 10,000 points. His face began to look a little ugly, but he still forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart. At this time, the drunken woman lying on the bed suddenly opened her eyes, and a meaningful smile appeared on her face. Interesting, this is really an interesting man, I am more and more interested in this man, the woman said softly and slowly. At this time, a man walked in directly from the window. When the woman saw the man, a bit of displeasure flashed across her face. Why is it you? The man suddenly smiled, isn't it me? Is it that handsome little brother? That man is much more terrible than you think. If you don't want to die, I think you'd better not take the initiative to provoke that man. The woman's eyes flashed with disdain, this has nothing to do with you. If you have anything to say, please tell me quickly. I want to rest. Wan Hao is a fence-sitter and is ready to hand that person over, so the organization has decided to get rid of this fence-sitter. This is your latest task. Take a good look at it yourself. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 370. At this time, the man directly handed the woman a note. After the woman took the note, her face began to look a little abnormal. At this time, the woman's eyes narrowed to a slit, a bit of gloom flashed in her eyes, and her brows seemed to be knitted together. What? You actually want to kill that person? Haven't we been trying to get the secrets about such things from this guy for such a long time? If we kill him now, what will happen? No, it's a failure. The man lit a cigarette, a trace of contempt flashed in his eyes. What we need to do now is not to consider whether this matter is necessary, but to consider what the superiors ask us to do. We just need to obey their arrangements honestly. Do you understand? The woman just turned her head and gave the man a cold look, and the sneer at the corner of her mouth began to become more and more obvious. Do you know what your tone of voice is becoming more and more like now? The man threw away the cigarette butt and stamped it out, then frowned slightly. Like what? A sweet smile appeared on the corner of the woman's mouth, and then she said calmly, looking more and more like a dog. As the woman spoke, she covered her face and let out a giggle. The man's face began to look more and more ugly, and then a self-deprecating smile appeared on his face at this moment. Then are you embarrassed to talk to me? Don't you know what you are like better than me? The man's voice was a little cold, and the woman's face was a little ugly. The air between the two people seemed to be completely frozen at this moment. The woman turned her head and stared at the man. You are such a disgusting guy. I have almost forgotten that unpleasant memory, but you damn guy insists on mentioning him. The man was laughing like this at that time. At this time, he seemed to be a complete madman. Ha ha ha, this matter is indeed my fault. I will treat you to dinner another day, but right now, you'd better not have too much contact with that man. You should be aware of how scary he is. The man's eyes were fixed on the woman, but the woman just waved casually and impatiently. I understand what you said, you can leave now. The woman's voice was quite cold, and the man just hesitated for a moment, then turned and left. At this moment, the smile on the woman's face became more and more obvious. It was obvious that she did not take the man's warning to her to heart. No matter what, you can't escape my grasp. At this moment, when Lin Yu was walking on the road, he sneezed heavily for no reason. He was also confused at this time and had no idea what was going on. How come you are sneezing when you are so good? At this moment, a figure suddenly stepped in front of Lin Yu. After Lin Yu saw the person's appearance clearly, his face sank slightly. Why is it you? The man suddenly laughed. Our young master is asking you to go back now. There is something he wants to discuss with you. Lin Yu's eyes narrowed to a slit, and then he frowned slightly. I don't think there is anything I can talk to your young master now. Maybe you'll know if you go and take a look. The man just stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face, opened the car door casually, and made a gesture of invitation. After Lin Yu saw this scene, a bit of ridicule flashed in his eyes, and then he shook his head and smiled. Things have come to this now, and it seems that it is impossible for me not to agree. The housekeeper just smiled and said nothing, but the meaning was very obvious. Lin Yu was also curious about what kind of medicine was sold in Xiao William's gourd, so Bien walked directly into the car. At this time, the car started driving after Lin Yu got up. The driver drove very smoothly along the way. Lin Yu even felt a little sleepy, and he just yawned. And then glanced at the old butler. The old butler was just sitting upright, but he paid attention to some etiquette in front of Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu just shook his head and smiled, but did not say anything more. The old housekeeper would glance in Lin Yu's direction from time to time, and the car soon drove into a mansion. At this time, little William was playing snooker, and there was a sexy and tall beauty next to him. However, it seemed that the bet between the two people was a little abnormal, and the beauty looked very bad, but the beauty's smile was extremely bright. In the end, little William made a hole-in-one, and then immediately turned his head and glanced at the beautiful woman, with a meaningful smile on his face. The beautiful woman looked at little William with a smile on her face. Your skills are so good, I seem to have lost everything this time. Little William smiled, and then he picked up a cigar. The beautiful woman walked to little William's side very wisely, and then she lightly lit the cigar for little William. I have a friend coming over in a minute. The beauty's eyes were obviously filled with excitement. After all, if someone could be called a friend of little William, he must be either rich or noble. At this moment, the woman's face suddenly showed a charming smile. I'm willing to accept the loss and listen to your arrangements tonight. After hearing what the woman said, little William nodded with satisfaction. At this moment, the door was suddenly knocked, and the woman sat directly next to little William. Little William didn't mind. Come in. The housekeeper was very tactful. After opening the door, Lin Yu walked in. After Lin Yu walked in, the housekeeper closed the door very tactfully. Lin Yu walked in front of little William. At this time, he just glanced at the woman, but after just a glance, he retracted his gaze, obviously not very interested in the woman. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on little William, and after a moment he suddenly smiled.